the repeated statement by Dr. Jeffrey Riddle that the manuscript tradition for the first 500 years of the New Testament is insufficient for the recreation of the text of the New Testament. That's what he said. He said it over and over again. He had a particular focus, partly because of the emphasis that I have upon these things. He had a particular focus upon the papyri, which he is frequently called the vaunted papyri. He has a very low view of the papyrological testimony. Papyri, in general, are the earliest manuscripts. There are some papyri that are later than some of the uncials we have. P74, for example, is like 7th century. But when we're talking about the major papyri, we're talking about P66, P75, P72, P45, and of course P46, the earliest collection of Paul's epistles, that date to the 2nd and 3rd centuries and give us an insight into the state of the text from 100 years prior to the great uncial texts, the parchment, the vellum manuscripts that we have in Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, later on Washingtonianus, and things like that. But what was said repeatedly by the representative of the TR-only position is in essence, we cannot recreate the text of the New Testament. So as I pointed out, I said, well, that would mean we cannot recreate the text of anything from antiquity, because of any work from antiquity, the testimony that we have to the New Testament is earlier, wider, and greater than any other work of antiquity. So you can't trust what you have for any of the Latin historians, Greek historians, Pliny, Suetonius, doesn't matter. Plato, who knows? We have no way of knowing. Utter and complete skepticism. A skepticism far beyond that of someone like Bart Ehrman. As I've pointed out, Bart Ehrman has said, we know what the New Testament said. We're just tinkering with a few little things here, there, and everywhere. But we'll never know with perfection, is what he would say. But I remind people of an atheist program he was on, being interviewed about his book, Misquoting Jesus. And after he went through a couple of the standard variants, the pericope adulterae, long writing remark, whatever, the atheist is like, so, Dr. Ehrman, in light of all this, what do you think the New Testament was originally about? What was its original storyline? And Ehrman's like, it was about Jesus as the Son of God coming to die and rise again. And he didn't get it. This atheist is thinking maybe this was about space gods from Kolob. Oh, that's a different group. Maybe it was about, some sci-fi type thing to make a great movie. And Ehrman's like, no, it's the story that we all know is the story of the New Testament. I mean, there might be some textual variants in Mark chapter 2, whether Jesus was angry or whether Jesus died by the grace of God or apart from God in Hebrews chapter 2. There's a couple little things like that, but it doesn't really change the storyline. It's not like some new story can be built out of it. And so even though Ehrman has his own kind of radical skepticism, remember that answer he gave in the audience question where, if I wanted real certainty about the Gospel of Mark, then I'd need to have 10 notarized copies that dated from within 2 months after Mark wrote it, and so on and so forth, type of an absurdity, which of course can't. His point was, can't do that. So he has that level of skepticism, which goes beyond the academy. But he doesn't have a skepticism that says, we can't even get close. We got no idea. Who knows? And as I said, he admitted, we have much earlier attestation for the New Testament than we have for any other work of antiquity. Quote, unquote. Excuse me, that's what he said. In our debate, you can go listen to it. So when the TR-only guys start saying, well, we can't recreate the text. Why does someone say that? See, when I hear that, I go, someone has an authority that they're about to introduce us to. Someone is promoting something. And so they have to denigrate the quality, depth, breadth, early attestation of the New Testament manuscript tradition to make room for whatever it is they're trying to sell us. And in this case, it's this strange phrase, providential eclecticism, which, as I pointed out, is just another way of saying re-inspiration. How else are you supposed to define it? How else are you supposed to define it? If you call it providential, then God is actively involved in doing what? He's guiding the choices that Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza made. Now, that means that when every one of those times where Erasmus looked at a text and went, yeah, well, it could be this and it could be that, and, maybe the shorter ending's better. In other words, he used the same methodologies that we use today in examining the text. And then he goes, I've said this, but I leave it to the reader. It could be that. It's up to you. That what he just happened to put in the text was exactly what the apostles had originally written. Not just what God was, quote unquote, re-inspiring, but what the apostles had originally written. Because the only way for this providential eclecticism to work is if the result is identical to what the apostles wrote, even if there's no evidence of it down through history. So providential eclecticism is a re-inspiration. It's, okay, the Reformation is happening. It's the biggest thing in church history. It's bigger than Nicaea. It's bigger than Chalcedon. It's bigger than all that stuff. And so finally, I got around to providentially leading mankind to develop the printing press. And so now's the time to provide the absolute inspired text. And I'm going to do it. And so I'm going to providentially guide every single one of the choices. Even, now think about this, even down to what happened with the book of Revelation. And as you know, Erasmus only had one manuscript. It was not a free-running manuscript. It was a commentary in Latin. It was missing some pages. He didn't do a good job pulling the text out. He made a bunch of mistakes, and he knew it, and he didn't care. He didn't care. So evidently, Erasmus was providentially made to not care about the canonical status of Revelation. He doesn't want to do the work to track down solid, sound Greek handwritten manuscripts for the book of Revelation for the next edition of his Greek New Testament. And so he writes a note to his printer. So the second edition says, go get the Aldine version. And whatever they have in theirs for Revelation, correct mine to fit theirs. That's how little he cared. Well, that was providential. He was caused providentially to not care about what was in Revelation. Here's the problem. The other guys were also caused to providentially not care about Revelation, so they just used his version. So there weren't any differences because they had already borrowed from Erasmus. They hadn't done their own work either. One of the reasons of that is there were providentially so few manuscripts of Revelation, especially in Greek. It's the book we have the fewest manuscripts of. And so errors that he knew about, never fixed over 5 editions because he thought they had been, and nobody was arguing about it. Nobody had access to enough information to even question it. And so those errors were promulgated, continued, and they're in the TR to this day, which means they were the original reading, providentially. That's the answer to everything from the TR providentially. Which a Calvinist can do that for everything. I mean, because there is a broad, massive sense in which Yep, it's all a part of God's decree. But that's not an argument. And there is not a Calvinist school on the planet that has ever accepted as the consistent response to every question on every test, God did it. God did it. And yet, that's what people are telling us. God did it. That's where it came from. And so, whatever ends up in the TR, which includes the longer ending here, that is the inspired reading. In fact, let me just look at something really, really quickly here. Well, that's interesting. They have huiou tu theou. So there is a expansion. So you have huiou tu theou in Mark 1:1. That's what you have in the TR, is the Son of God with an article included. Now, let's take a look at something here. I brought up, so here is Codex Vaticanus. Now, interestingly enough, someone this morning was basically saying that anyone who would utilize or promote a Bible translation that includes Codex Vaticanus is a heretic. That is heresy. So what you're looking at, according to certain people on the internet, is heresy, when it's actually simply one of the manuscripts, in all probability, that were copied after the Council of Nicaea with funds that were provided by Constantine to help replace many of the manuscripts that had been destroyed by the Roman Empire only 15, 20 years earlier. And what you want to note here is you've got the big fancy alpha over here, and then you've got Arche to Euangeliu, and then notice right here, so here's Euangeliu, the gospel, and then you have what are called nomina sacra. So this is Jesu, and notice the line up above. So that's the two-letter abbreviation of Jesus, Christu. There's the line. And then here we have huiou spelled out, and then theou, there's the line for the nomina sacra right there. So notice what you have here in majuscule text, sometimes called unsealed text. That's a technical term. You have these upsilons, and you have a number of omicron upsilons. So the end, this is a long genitive train, okay? And so you have omicron, upsilon. Here's another upsilon after iota, then chi upsilon, and then huiou, of course, begins and ends with an upsilon and has two vowels in between it, and then theou. So that's a lot of upsilons in a row. And so most of the discussion concerning this variant has not been focused upon the theology. The vast majority of textual discussion, especially up until Bart Ehrman in 93, assumed, and interestingly enough, even though Bart Ehrman wrote Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, he also has admitted that the vast majority of variations are not theologically motivated. He tries to say certain ones are. I think he fails at that in a number of different places. But the point is that even he admits, in general, scribes really tried to do a good job. Bezé is off by itself, and you've got this, that, or there, but in general, they did an amazingly good job. And so most of the discussion has been, what about this line would cause the variations that we see amongst the manuscripts? Because if we go back to the textual interlinear here for this reading, over here is where we've got huiou theou, Son of God. All right, and so then we come down to here. Here's Sinaiticus, and Sinaiticus does not have huiou theou. You have Jesu Christu. So Arche tu Euangeliu huiou Christou. But Vaticanus, arche tu euangeliou, huiou Christou, huiou theou, Son of God, huiou spelled out fully. Washingtonianus also has huiou theou, and interestingly enough, Alexandrinus has huiou Christou tu theou, not tu huiou theou. Now, that would make perfect sense, to be honest with you, because we English-speaking people might go, the of God? That doesn't make any sense, but in Greek it would make perfect sense, because in genealogies and things like that, that would be a fully acceptable and understandable form. That would mean the Son of God. You wouldn't have to repeat it. But it is interesting that you have amongst these important manuscripts, early manuscripts, first 500 years manuscripts, you have a lack of the word, then you have two huious. If I hadn't pointed out, would your eyes immediately have recognized that Codex Alexandrinus actually has a different reading? Because it's still two, and it looks a lot, especially in that line of genitives, like huiou, but it's two. All right? Now, one of the points I've been trying to make over the course of years, how you are listening to me right now says a lot about your level of confidence in how God has transmitted the text of his scriptures over time. There are people, and I understand there are people, but in this instance, there is nothing I can do about trying to help these people feel better about themselves. There are people who do not believe we should be looking at things like this. There are some people who say it's nitpicking, straining out gnats. I had that used on Facebook today. Straining at gnats. Doesn't matter. Who cares? Then there are others who are like, you should not talk about stuff like this. As if I don't talk about it, then nobody else will either. No, I assure you, other people will, and they will in a context of unbelief. And that leaves Christians sitting in the context of silence and ignorance. That's not a good thing. But there are people who really, really do not think that we should even be talking about this stuff. They don't want notes in their Bible. They don't want to know that Sinaiticus, and these are earliest sources. Again, we don't have the beginning of Mark. Wish we did. Maybe someday we will. But we don't have the beginning of Mark in a singular papyrus. So these are our earliest sources. Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Washingtonianus, Alexandrinus. So we're looking at the earliest sources here. And there's a variant. And there's a difference. And there are people who are afraid of history. They are afraid of how God transmitted the text of Scripture. That's why they want something better in their thinking. They've never thought this through. But they're literally saying, I want something better than what God provided in history. And they live in a day where they can pretend to offer something like that, because they live in a day that's half a millennium after the invention of printing in the West. And printing certainly helps to solidify a text, but now they live in a day of digital imagery. And so you can reproduce a text exactly. Mankind could not do that until 1949. And certainly not in the digital way we do now until only a matter of decades ago. And so there are people living in this age that want to go, I want something better than what was provided to the church for the first 1,000 years or more, where they had to regularly discuss differences in manuscripts, where everyone who wrote on this subject, Origen and Jerome especially, as two of the most focused individuals, recognized, well, as Jerome said, in his day, The best manuscripts didn't have the longer ending of Mark. That's what he said. Eusebius said the same thing. By the time of Victor, that's starting to change. But that's what they said. And they didn't have access to anything like this. They couldn't compare manuscripts. They didn't have identification of manuscripts. They didn't have a catalog. There was no central location that kept track of these things. Would have made things a lot easier, but they didn't have it. We do now. And so now we have to take advantage of all the information we have, or you just throw it all out. As someone said after the debate, well, it seems like what one side is saying is you should just burn all the manuscripts that have been discovered since the TR was published. Because as far as it having an impact on the reading of the New Testament, that's true. That would be the logical result. I mean, what good are the vaunted papyri to Dr. Riddle? The only time he's going to make reference to the vaunted papyri is when he can try to twist P46 into a support for the reading of koinonia at Ephesians 3:9, which it cannot be. So if the papyri disagree with the TR, and they do, then how are they even useful? Why should they not just simply not be destroyed? Good question. I mean, Dr. Riddle will say, oh, I'm not against the study of these things, but I just want to go, but why? Why study these things? What good does it do? What positive thing does it add is what I want to know. Outside of, I guess they could argue, well, it's an example, a warning of the corruption that can happen to the scriptures. I bet you that would probably be one of the type of things that would be argued. I don't know. The point is, we're looking at the earliest sources for Mark. And if we are people of truth, we're going to speak the truth about what's there. We cannot avoid that. We cannot avoid that. So when we go back, here is Vaticanus, and yes, it has huiou theou. It has the long ending without the article. So it has Son of God. And this has not been inserted at a later point. I mean, you can tell by where the letters are in the line and so on and so forth that this is where it's always been. You'll notice the next line has been written in Isaiah, the prophet. That becomes another important textual variant that we'll look at another point, I suppose. Let's look over at Codex Sinaiticus. K to Euangeliou. Now notice, again, in majuscule text, all capital form letters is what we would call them. Basically no punctuation, no spacing between words. And so you can break words at places we would never break words. So Euangeliou. And the problem is that actually adds to the issue because now you have the genitive ending starting a line of what would have been genitive endings. But you notice, Euangeliou, huiou, Christou, and then it moves on, just as it is written in the prophets. If you look real carefully, someone has written in huiou theou, 4 letters, so they're using the nomina sacra with the line over top. So a correction has been made to the manuscript and included huiou theou. Now, what that means is when you use something like the Nestle-Aland text or something along those lines, and you look at the variants, here is where it'll have the variant. Let me blow it up so you can see it. Notice what you have here. You have Sinaiticus, asterisk, that's the Aleph, Sinaiticus 1. So what they're saying is that the omission is found in the original hand of Sinaiticus, and that's what we saw. But then the first corrector has added the text, huiou theou, in. And so on the part of the editors, the assumption is that that was first corrector, which may have been concurrent with, at the same time, first reader of the manuscript when it was produced in a scriptorium. Because the handwriting is similar, though it's much, much smaller. Some of the corrections we see elsewhere, completely different ink, completely different handwriting, happened at much later time. There's entire books about the various correctors of Sinaiticus and things like that. But that's what the 1 and the asterisk or a 2 or things like that indicate when you see something along those lines. So there's the evidence. And it doesn't change a whole lot. Now, there are people who will look at this and say, see, nobody can know. Because they are not accustomed to dealing with anything from antiquity. In fact, a lot of these people are not even accustomed to dealing with the stories I've told about some of the papers I wrote in college and how you had to copy stuff out of books and you had to buy stuff like this. This was really cool. I think they still exist, but a place called Levenger. It's a book weight, and it's for holding books open. And you had to do that so you could hold a book open so that you could copy out of the book. And that meant going back and forth your eyes, and you would learn very quickly the kinds of errors you can make. If all you've ever done is cut and paste, then you need to realize that the world is a whole lot different in the past and the not too distant past. But there are a lot of people who are very, very uncomfortable with the recognition of these things. And so what they're willing to say is, A, we can't reconstruct the text. They've never really tried, but they come to the conclusion because there are differences, we can't, and therefore we need a new inspiration. We need, since my mind can't wrap itself around how for 1,500 years Christians dealt with this and it didn't cause them to lose their faith, it's going to cause me to lose mine. Therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore all of this stuff. I'm going to push all the history off to the side. And I'm going to grab hold of one thing. Now, for the King James onlyists, it's King James Version of the Bible. For the TR onlyists, it's the TR, which it's interesting to me, the vast majority of them still end up being King James only too, as far as the translation I use. If I was TR only, I'd at least use the New King James. But no, normally it ends up being King James. So this is the mindset. I cannot allow the historical reality of what you're showing me on the screen. And so I'm going to grab hold of an objective, unchanging standard. I'm going to ignore how it came into existence. I'm going to ignore its own history. And I'm going to make it the standard. And if you keep pointing out what its history was, I'm going to say you're arguing like an atheist. May I suggest something to you? The skepticism that Jeffrey Riddle expressed was much more like the skepticism of atheism than anything I would ever express. I believe that the New Testament manuscript tradition is fully capable of telling us what the apostles wrote. Jeffrey Riddle doesn't believe that. In fact, one of the things I like about the Tyndale House, even though I disagree with it, for example, the John 1:18, but one of the things I like about this is that if a reading is going to appear in the main text of this, it has to be witnessed within the first 500 years. Well, that means that the manuscript tradition has to be sufficient in the first 500 years to tell us that. Well, thanks be to God, it is. Oh, but we have thousands of manuscripts later. Yeah, as you would expect. I mean, shouldn't you have more manuscripts from 500 years ago than from 1,500 years ago? I mean, isn't that sort of logical? It is. It is. But the skepticism of the TR-only position that was enunciated, those early manuscripts, the papyri and the uncials, and even the early Byzantine manuscripts, it's just not enough. Why isn't it enough? We weren't told. We weren't told. But my guess would be because of the standard that's being used. The standard is, and this is what you hear all the time, both from King James Onlyists and TR Onlyists, well, you have to have absolute certainty about the reading of every single text. There can be no questions. And don't remind me that Christians had lived with that for 1,500 years before Erasmus. And don't remind me that Erasmus would have laughed heartily if he had ever known what his own Greek New Testament would be turned into by the TR-only movement. I mean, it's sort of like how Dean Burgon could never be a member of the Dean Burgon Society because he didn't believe the things the Dean Burgon Society believes. And it's the same thing here. Erasmus would have scoffed at this position. He would have said, did you read anything I wrote? Did you read my annotations? Did you see how many times I said, might be this, might be that? I don't know. It's up to you. And you've now turned what I did into an autograph? What? He wouldn't have even had a category to put such an action in. But again, once you get but the Reformation was so important. Remember, Erasmus didn't join the Reformation. But the Reformation is so important, and so the text that came out of it, they must have done all this work. Well, they didn't. It was the default text. It's what they had. There was no ability. The Academy had spoken. As much as they disliked the Academy, Erasmus and Stephanus and Beza were the Academy. And the Academy spoke, not the church. There weren't any councils. There wasn't anybody sitting around going, oh, no, it must be koinonia, not oikonomia. They didn't even know there was a difference. Weren't even aware of it. They didn't even argue about it. It was the default text. But that's what was providentially given. And once you buy that, all this looking at Son of God and CBGM and all the rest of that stuff doesn't matter. You've already got your answers. You've already got your answers. But that kind of skepticism is horrifically destructive because you send a young person into the university setting and you mix this deadly cocktail in their thinking of the New Testament manuscript tradition is insufficient in and of itself to recreate the text. So therefore, God did it using Erasmus and Beza primarily, without their knowing it. And that's how you're supposed to defend your text of Scripture against the attacks of all of the children of Bart Ehrman. Yeah, there you go. That kind of skepticism is not only unwarranted, it's extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous.